Howdy, everybody. Welcome. Happy New Year. To begin with, Desmond Tutu is on my mind today for a lot of reasons. He just keeps popping up, and I know in part because of his recent death. But he has a spiritual biographer, and his spiritual biographer wrote a little article for the Centering Prayer newsletter in Chicago. And he detailed Desmond Tutu's daily spiritual practice. And it was so amazing. I thought I'd share it with you and then just to have a few moments of silence. According to his spiritual biographer, Desmond Tutu woke up at like 3 or 4 in the morning and enjoyed four hours of prayer and silence, and was then at his desk at 9 or 10 o'clock. And during this time of silence, there was prayer. There was also walking that was involved, probably scripture reading and other things. But what was emphasized was the silence. 4 hours of silence before he got going. And then from 1 to 3, he did napping / silence. And then sometimes he'd be on the road, of course, and people would book him for appearances and activities, morning, noon, and night. And his people would have to say to him, do you want the real Desmond Tutu, the one that you see on TV, who's full of energy and life and insight and wisdom? If so, you need to block out 4 hours before 9 o'clock and then 2 hours after lunch, because that's how the Tutu that we know on TV is who he is. It's because he was always rejuvenating himself spiritually. So with Desmond Tutu's practice of rich silence, rich and ample silence every day, we don't have time to do 6 hours of silence, but we have time to do 1 minute. So I invite you to simply be in silence for a minute. And just breathe in, pay attention to your breathing and your being, your thoughts, your feelings, your bodily sensations. So surrounded by holy presence, filled with holy presence, and knowing that the presence is among and between us, we begin. So today, by the way, Chuck is joining us, attempting to join us with his phone, and the princes are here. We welcome you too. Today, we're going to do an hour on liberation theology. Liberation theology is another way that Christian theologians, pastors, lay people have taken the historic faith and applied it to real problems in our world today. Back in October, when you gave me your feedback about what's important to you, you said that that's important to you, that the faith of our mothers and fathers, the faith of Jesus, and all the church members, saints in between then and now, that this be applicable to real world issues today. Liberation theology is all about that. And so I thought we could spend an hour on that. Next week, we're going to do the Bible, the whole Bible in an hour. No, we're not going to do the whole Bible, but we'll talk about how you can read a Bible text as ancient as it is in a way that it still works for us today. It speaks to our spirits and helps direct our lives today. After that, we've got a couple of sessions on other classic Christian theological categories like prayer, grace, sacraments, the cross. And then on February 13th, Rudy Reyes, an instructor from Garrett Evangelical Seminary, will be with us. His area of interest is what he calls the divergent Christ, by which he means not every human brain is the same. Neurodiversity. There are many ways of thinking, feeling, perceiving, making sense of the world. And yet we tend to think that there's only one right way, that there's a normal mind. He said we need to abolish the concept of a normal mind and embrace all the ways that people perceive the world. And he has a whole theological project he calls the Divergent Christ about this. Does that sound interesting?
Yes.
Wait, it sounds really different. So it's, hello, Chuck.
Hello.
Hi, Chuck is waving at me. That's February 13th. And then February 20th, we'll wrap this one up. And February 27th, we'll be on to another module. I've got 2 videos and a PowerPoint for you today. The first is I think a 12-minute or so introduction to liberation theology by someone who is herself a Latin American theologian.
Broadly speaking, liberation theology can be defined as a praxis-oriented theology that used the tools of the social sciences to move the church beyond simple charity work towards a more active role in the promotion of social justice. Each liberation theology, whether African American, feminist, or Latin American, emerged in a different context. Each movement is characterized by its distinctive viewpoint, but what they all share is a commitment to social justice. This video is about Latin American liberation theology, which emerged in the 1960s from a particular historical context in which issues of land distribution, race, power, and economic development were deeply intertwined. Unlike in the United States or Western Europe, the poverty in Latin American nations is pervasive, endemic, and imposed by industrialized nations. First, let's examine the context in which liberation theology developed in Latin America. Religion played a major role in the conquest of the Americas, and the church naturally aligned itself with the governing elite during the colonial period when the Catholic faith was imposed on indigenous people. Even after independence in the 19th century, the Catholic Church continued to function as one of the main pillars of power. That explains why most Latin American revolutionary movements of the 20th century have been largely anti-clerical. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States replaced Britain as the largest investor in Latin America. In the 1950s, U.S. relations with Latin America were at a low point. After World War II, the United States provided massive economic recovery packages for Western Europe and Japan. Latin American nations felt that they had been left out despite their contributions during the war. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the United States tried to win back hemispheric influence through a carrot and stick combination of financial assistance and military repression. In 1961, President Kennedy launched the Alliance for Progress to promote social and economic development within a democratic framework. Development in actuality meant siphoning off Latin American resources to the United States, Britain, and Western European nations. The populist governments of the 1950s and 1960s, especially those of Perón in Argentina, Vargas in Brazil, and Cárdenas in Mexico, promoted significant industrial development in the form of import substitution. This not only caused massive urbanization and deruralization, but also led to the emergence of civilian dissent and guerrilla insurgencies. These movements, in turn, provoked the rise of military dictatorships, which sought to protect the interests of capital through political repression. While the military kept order with varying degrees of human rights violations, civilian economists and technocrats directed other policies in a system called bureaucratic authoritarianism. The understanding was that only the military could take the harsh measures needed to curb inflation, reassure foreign and domestic investors, and speed up economic growth to the point where democracy could be safely practiced. Through the Alliance for Progress, the United States trained Latin American militaries to put down the guerrilla insurgencies. And in every single case from the 1960s through the 80s, oppressive governments in Latin America were supported either overtly or covertly by the United States. This heavy military repression from above received tacit approval from the Church. So it was not a coincidence that liberation theology emerged in Latin America in the 1960s as a response to the military dictatorships and social crises. Catholic priests and bishops accused the military and government of lacking sensitivity to the misery of the poor. They saw the poor as victims of institutional violence by the rich and powerful. They described the situation as unjust and became actively engaged in improving the lives of the poor in their pursuit of social justice. These Latin American clerics represented a new way of doing theology by encouraging a break from an elitist notion of the Church. They established base communities, which were grassroots organizations, that not only studied the Bible but also attempted to meet their community's immediate needs for food, water, sewage disposal, and electricity. By using Christianity as a tool towards a more perfect society, liberation theologians dramatically changed the relationship between the Church and the state, as well as the relationship between the Church and the people. In 1968, several Latin American bishops met at Medellin in Colombia. At this meeting, Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian theologian and priest, emphasized the Church's mission to the poor. In 1971, Gutierrez published A Theology of Liberation. This book became a seminal work for the movement and gave the movement its name, and Gutierrez is considered as one of the main architects of Latin American liberation theology. Father Gutierrez did not represent Lima's aristocracy. He grew up in a poor family, but because of his intellectual aptitude, he was offered an opportunity to pursue graduate studies in Belgium and France. In Europe, he mastered traditional theology, but after he returned to Peru, Gutierrez realized that the theories he had learned in Europe were not designed to address issues of poverty and oppression in Latin America. The texts that he had studied focused only on spiritual salvation. There was nothing about liberation from physical oppression, and the Church did not protect the people from human rights violations, poverty, and armed conflicts. Gutierrez was trained in academic theology, but he broke from some of its conventions and viewpoints. Gutierrez is considered to be the founder of Latin American liberation theology because he aligned the role of the Church with the needs of the people by focusing on the importance of social justice in the Bible. Latin American liberation theology developed in response to a new understanding of the Church's relationship to the people and the role of faith in the context of poverty and social inequality. Liberation theologians outlined 3 steps to explain how Catholic teachings could be applied for material and spiritual liberation. The first step towards salvation is the transformation of society. The poor must be freed from economic, political, and social oppression. In the early stages, liberation theologians relied heavily on the work of dependency theorists, who claimed that the underdevelopment of Latin American nations was a direct consequence of economic dependence on Europe and the United States. Their economic theory suggested that underdevelopment is not a prior stage in the natural economic development of nations, but rather an integral dimension of the international economic order created by colonialism, imperialism, and neo-imperialism. Liberation theologians denounced capitalism as the cause of poverty and oppression in Latin America. Rather than focusing solely on the potential of the afterlife, liberation theologians urged the Church to help poor people and proposed a preferential option for the poor. Liberation theologians defined the poor primarily in economic terms. Their focus was on material poverty, not spiritual poverty. So overcoming poverty became a fundamental tenet of Latin American liberation theology. They emphasize that the face of Christ emerges in the poor. Liberation theologians emphasize that Christians must support the poor and dismantle the oppressive political and economic systems that exploit labor and resources. They viewed Jesus as the liberator who is always on the side of the poor. Because of God's preference for the poor, liberation theology called for the reorganization of social, governmental, and economic structures that caused poverty. The Vatican actively repressed liberation theologians because they used Marxist critiques of ideology, class, and capitalism to assert that the Bible condemns the enrichment of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. But the connections between Marxism and liberation theology were not clear-cut, because unlike Marxist movements, liberation theology was non-elitist and it was connected to the grassroots through religion. And liberation theologians emphasized the need for liberation rather than development, which was the buzzword of progressives. The second step towards salvation is the transformation of the self. Liberation theologians encourage people to become active agents of their own destiny and to liberate themselves from injustice. Many priests lived among the peasants and taught parishioners that instead of just adoring Jesus, it was more important to follow his example and fight against social sin and evil in the world. This involved self-organization in the struggle against capitalism. In Nicaragua, for example, Father Ernesto Cardenal, together with many members of the Solentiname community, played an active role in the Sandinista revolution. A few liberation theologians were also appointed as leaders in the new government, including Miguel Diaz-Coto as foreign minister and Ernesto Cardenal as the minister of culture. So the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua became a symbol of hope for liberation, reviving the idea of Christian participation in revolutions against repressive governments. The third step is the transformation of our relationship with God, specifically the liberation from sin. At the theological level, liberation from sin would result in ultimate liberation and communion with God. The Vatican and the United States strongly condemned liberation theology. President Ronald Reagan's foreign policy framed it as a weapon against private property and productive capitalism. The Vatican responded by appointing very conservative bishops in Latin America. In 1979, at the Puebla Conference, Pope John Paul II declared that the connection between liberation theology and Marxism were incompatible with Catholic teachings. And in 1983, when Pope John Paul II visited Nicaragua, he publicly scolded Ernesto Cardenal and silenced several priests. The repression beyond church hierarchy was worse. Several radio stations, bishops, and nuns who were sympathetic to liberation theology were censored, expelled, imprisoned, or assassinated. In El Salvador, Father Rutilio Grande was killed. In 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero was gunned down in church during Mass by a right-wing death squad soon after he made a special address to soldiers not to obey their superiors. In 1989, Jesuit theologian Ignacio Ellacuría was murdered along with few other priests at the Central American University. With the transitions to democracy and the collapse of the military dictatorships in the early 1990s, liberation theology lost its momentum. Latin American liberation theology had very little impact in Europe or the United States. Now, whether liberation theology can be revitalized to address issues of social justice in the 21st century is a subject to debate. But if you are interested in learning more about liberation theology and the life and work of Father Romero, I recommend watching the 1989 biopic called Romero. In 2018, Father Romero was canonized by Pope Francis.
Maybe as I'm going to the next video, you would like to maybe write down some of your questions. But I'd like to show you this next video first, because it might actually answer some of your questions. This next video is kind of hard to hear. I think this next video was done for somebody's presentation in a college or seminary class, but it's really quite a good summary of liberation theology on its own. And it focuses on Gustavo Gutierrez.
This presentation is about what Gustavo Gutierrez, who's a Dominican priest, what he writes about in terms of what makes an action ethical, what makes a society ethical according to liberation theology. Gustavo Gutierrez is the father of liberation theology. He's the first person to pen these ideas. So his context, he is born 1928, so it precedes the Great Depression in Peru. So he's from South America. He's a Catholic Dominican priest, and he penned the first principles and coined the term liberation theology. Currently, he serves as a university professor at Notre Dame. The book that he wrote, A Theology of Liberation, is what got him on the map. Liberation theology, as defined by Gutierrez, is a theology that speaks to and from the preferential option for the poor. And he argues that what this means, how can you tell a poor person that God loves you? He poses that question, and he says it's difficult because the poor person's daily life seems like the negation of love. Why do we care about the poor, according to Gutierrez? Because God does, and this is found over and over again in Scripture, whether it be through sending Jesus at the incarnation, or the healing of the lame, or the mute, or the poor, or whatever it is, freeing of slaves. Why care about the poor? Because God continuously does over and over and over again in Scripture. The nature of alleviating poverty, in order to do that, you must first understand the complexities of poverty. What poverty is, the definition. And then you must understand the experience of poverty. And how you do this is being with the poor. And so here's a picture of Pope Francis. This is right after he was elected Pope in 2013. And here he is kissing the feet of the people incarcerated in Rome, of people who are Muslim, of women. And it's the first time that's ever been done. That's an example, a great example that we look up to. Now, Gutierrez describes poverty as scandal. And this comes from the Gospel of Luke, when talking about the Beatitudes, he says, "Blessed are the poor, for the kingdom is yours." And what this means, how he describes this, is in following Jesus and living out this Beatitude, being committed to alleviating poverty as a scandalous condition through charity. So donating money, donating clothes, food, whatever it may be. So it's the people who have giving to those who do not have. And that's how you can work with poverty as scandal. However, he takes poverty a step further. He says poverty is not merely a scandalous condition. Poverty is also a spirituality, and this is based in the Gospel of Matthew, where it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The poor in spirit, as opposed to "blessed are the poor" in Luke's Gospel. And this comes from Jesus living a poor life, choosing to live a poor life, and thus the vocation of Jesus' followers is to also live a poor life. And that is through the idea of solidarity. Mother Teresa, being from Calcutta, living with the people of Calcutta, working to from their experience to better their lives, is a great example of choosing poverty. So how does Gutierrez define poverty? Poverty, in its basic sense, is defined as the absence of wealth in terms of economics, which certainly is one major part of poverty. However, poverty itself is very complex and diverse as a term, and so Gutierrez expands the definition and says it's not merely those who are economically poor, but those who are socially poor, those who are based in society deemed non-persons, people who are invisible or lack respect or insignificant. And thus poverty expands from being merely economic to include cultural poverty and racial poverty and ethnic poverty and gender poverty and religious poverty, among others. Sexual orientation, for example, is a form of poverty. And this is seen perhaps in today's Black Lives Matter movement that's been happening over the past year or so. The historical causes of poverty, is important to recognize where this poverty comes from. It comes from the way societies are structured, the way they were constructed by people, and a way of keeping some people elite and oppressing others. But it also comes from our mental categories, how we think about people, how we classify people, as that's a poor person, that's a violent person, that's however we categorize people. And so Gutierrez explains then, poverty is not merely something that people are stuck in, but it is a condition. Humans cause poverty, and as an experience, people can come out of poverty. It is a temporary condition. People are not poor because God made them poor. People are poor because humans made them poor. And thus humans can lift people out of poverty. And when I say poverty, I'm using Gutierrez's definition, including all types of poverty, not just economic. Poverty is not a fate, it is a condition. It is not a misfortune, it is an injustice. And the implication there then is to lift people out of poverty is not to make them rich, it is to be just. And then Gutierrez describes poverty as death. And he talks about a physical death, that is, poor dying easily of curable illnesses that you would not die for in richer nations, and that can be seen from anywhere from malaria to diarrhea to HIV/AIDS not being a big problem in the richer nations, although certainly can be a problem, and it affects some populations. But in the poorer nations, it affects people disproportionately compared to the richer nations. So poverty means physical death, but it also means a cultural death. The poor's way of life is destroyed or is deemed insignificant. And here's a picture of the death of the Native American population. It is an allusion to Christ at the scourging of the pillar, and the cultural death, how a population's way of life ceases to be. And the important thing then to do is what is the root cause of this poverty? And Gutierrez explains in theological terms that it is merely a refusal to love. People who have the ability to change structures in society refusing to do so. And that is the definition of sin. And so then he says, how can we make a society just? It is through the preferential option for the poor. And he describes the preferential option for the poor and defines them in this order: poor, preferential, and then option. To be poor, the definition of poor, he deals with the real poor, not merely the spiritual poor, but the people who are materially poor, the people who are culturally poor, ethnically poor, the people who are deemed insignificant in society. Spiritual poverty is important and being dependent on only God and not material things, but it is not the idea of what he's talking about in preferential option for the poor. The real poor, he's talking about the ethnic poor, the material poor, not the spiritual poor. Preferential means, certainly as theology, as a Catholic priest, he identifies that God does love everyone. And takes it a step further and says God prefers the poor. This preference is God's love made manifest in the world. What this means, when we choose to prefer the poor, God is working through us, and we are doing God's will in the world. And the image that we use in class, or that he uses in the reading, is that of a family. protecting the younger sibling from older siblings who may be bullying them or just teasing them or whatever it might be. Or perhaps the image of a sick family member. When somebody in your family is sick, the rest of the family or one person or a few other people help that person get better or are with that person more. That is what it means to, it doesn't mean you love that person who's sick or that younger sibling more than the others. It just means that you are actively working to serve that person more intentionally. That is what he means by preferential. And in order to do understand the preferential term, he talks about the historical reality of personal and social adversity. You understand the context, where today's society came from, the history, and then you can do social analysis. And that is analyzing the causes and patterns of poverty, ultimately to then overcome them. And that is done through human compassion. Why care? Because God does. And that is a vocation as a Christian, as a person who believes in God, not necessarily even Christian. And then the last term is option. Option he defines as a free decision, but it's not merely a free decision. It's more than that. It is a conversion. That is experiencing one way of life and to leaving that current way of life and choosing another way of life, particularly that of the preferential option for the poor. And Gutierrez argues that this is a duty for all Christians, the non-poor and the poor. The poor must also have a preferential option for the poor. We hear all the time of poor exploiting each other. That's not what Gutierrez is encouraging. Everybody, including the poor, must have a preferential option for the poor. But especially the non-poor must have a preferential option for the poor. And that deals in not just material and other charitable things, but actually sharing life with the poor. And that is done in a lifetime, years, not merely a service trip or a day of service, but your whole life, a vocation to share life with the poor. And that is, in that way, we can get to know poverty, but not imitate poverty. He's not saying we all should become beggars on the street or things like that, or become oppressed persons in society, but rather understand the perspective of those who are poor. So we have that relationship with the people who are poor and that perspective on society, and then we work to overcome it. And so thus, if you take these ideas and you apply to this idea, what makes a social action just? And Gutierrez would say, and pose a question, is this social action taken to alleviate poverty? Is it actually taken to alleviate poverty? And then the second thing, and it's not just it, the second part is the social action taken from the perspective of the poor? So it needs to not only be directed towards alleviating poverty, but it needs to come from the perspective of the poor, and that is done in building relationships. And then he poses the question again, how can you tell a poor person that God loves you? Build relationships with the real poor, learn from the people what is needed, and then implement policies from their perspective that serve their needs and interests. And that is how you achieve liberation. That is a famous scene in the movie, Andy Dufresne in Shawshank Redemption, when he is finally free. Now, there are many critiques of this theory, historical critiques. One of the main critiques is that faith seems to be reduced to politics. Which side is this person of faith on? And the bigger critique, perhaps, is that liberation theology seems to justify socialism or communism, depending on what branch you're reading. And what that means is government control of everything and socialism. And that could, to get to that point, that could perhaps, and it has historically had violent implications. That in order to overthrow these structural historical injustices, there needs to be violence. And that has been the critique of it. Now, Gutierrez disagrees with that critique and says it is not political theory, it is a theology. It comes from God. It doesn't come from how people deal in political life. And not only that, but because it comes from God, it is not intended to be violent. However, it's not a far jump to say, and the critique would, the argument, counter argument would be that the only possible way to do that is through violence. And this also may include the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which is why this theory kind of has been marginalized historically. In the 80s, it was done by Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict XVI. In the 80s, he was very critical of liberation theology for these very reasons. Now, there seems to be a little bit of a revival with Pope Francis that has yet to be seen, but it is important to note that the Catholic Church never deemed liberation theology heretical. Never. They may have not used it a lot, but they never said it was against church teaching. And in May of 2015, Francis invited Gutierrez to Rome to participate in a meeting with this relief organization called Caritas International as outside theologian, and another famous proponent of liberation theology, Oscar Romero, was finally beatified in May of 2015 as well. And so there seems to be somewhat of relaxing of the tensions with liberation theology, but that is yet to be seen. And there's a picture of Gutierrez meeting Pope Francis in Rome. That is all for the presentation. Hope you enjoyed this.
As if that wasn't enough, I do have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to just highlight a couple of things in the PowerPoint. That video may have also prompted some thoughts or questions from you. All right, I'm going to go through this so I can leave time for conversation. I thought it was important to mention a couple other contexts of liberation theology. The first is the Holocaust. This should actually be Johann Baptist Metz, a German theologian. He is quoted, I don't know if this is an accurate quote, but it's a good quote, whether it comes from him or not. You can't do theology after 1945 with your back turned toward Auschwitz. I mean, World War II created a crisis for theology, not only a crisis for the world. You know, how does one believe in God in light of Auschwitz? How does one respond ethically in light of Auschwitz? Metz is saying that any theology must deal with the most extreme forms of human cruelty. Otherwise, it's an inadequate theology. Liberation theology does address this. Likewise, Robert McAfee Brown, I remember this quote from seminary, but I cannot find it on the internet. He's a liberation theologian. He said something like this: all theology must be done in light of children who are burned in armed conflict. That's not the quote, but you get the picture. It's similar to Johann Baptist Metz. The other context worth noting is when those Latin American bishops gathered in Medellin in 1968, they were responding directly to the Second Vatican Council, which had just ended 3 years before. What the Second Vatican Council called the Roman Catholic Church to do and be is to be relevant to the local needs of the people. This is what Karl Rahner said. Karl Rahner is a German theologian who wrote many of the documents in Second Vatican Council. He said the church must be a church of the people. It must not speak at some high level of theory, of disembodied beliefs. It must speak to the local situations of the people. So when the Catholic bishops gathered in 1968, they said, oh, we can make that happen for Latin America. And liberation theology was born. So it's important to note that perhaps a broader term for liberation theology than liberation theology is contextual theology. These theologies always begin with the real lived experiences of actual human beings, not the elite, but real average people. and more than just average people, people who are overlooked by your typical theologies, church membership, and having sort of mainstream respect in society and so on. So in this sense, it's not just a liberation of people, it's a liberation of theology. Here's the basic method of liberation theology. It's called Praxis, which is a Marxist term. It's the process by which a theory is enacted. How does something that's theoretical actually get put into practice on the ground? And the three steps in liberation theology are see, judge, act. See is to use social science or any kind of analytical tool to name and see exactly what's going on in people's lives. Name it. Judge. Decide whether and what, in light of the gospel, needs to change about what you're seeing. Act. It's not enough to see it and to judge it. You must put this into practice and make real change. Otherwise, it just remains theory, and who cares? So a key point in liberation theology is using social critiques to see. And the predominant social critique that liberation theology has used is Marxism, because Marxism isn't just about economics. Marxism is a sociological view of economics, politics, and culture, including religion. Marxist sociology looks at everything and the interactions of everything at the same time. But the basic question of liberation theology is always, why is this the way it is? Why? So the great quote from the liberation theologian Dom Helder Camara is, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. This term, preferential option for the poor, the last presenter explained this, but just to make it clear, this doesn't mean that God doesn't love everybody. God loves everybody, but prefers the poor, actively prefers the poor, like a family member that surrounds and protects its most vulnerable member. Pope Francis has changed the Roman Catholics' level of acceptance of liberation theology. His predecessor, as the last presenter mentioned, Pope Benedict XVI, when he was the prefect for the doctrine of the faith in the Catholic Church under Pope John Paul II, Cardinal Ratzinger actively opposed liberation theology, and in 1984 wrote a scathing critique that was sent to all Catholic churches around the world. Pope Francis is bringing liberation theology back somewhat. Not only has he beatified Oscar Romero, but in 2018, he canonized Oscar Romero. So Oscar Romero is now Saint Oscar Romero. And this is Francis's famous quote, "This is what I want, a poor church for the poor." These base Christian communities, that was covered in previous presentations. So again, Desmond Tutu's on my mind a lot. I think he's an example of someone who used liberation theology in a real context, the context of apartheid in South Africa, galvanizing the church's teachings to speak freedom and act for freedom. And sometimes this meant pushing back against other Christians, especially the predominantly white Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. But this is a quote I found from Desmond Tutu regarding the relationship of his project to Latin American liberation theology. In 1985, liberation theologians in South Africa issued what they called the Kairos document, which used all the categories and language of liberation theology to say that apartheid cannot be reformed, it must be abolished. It is contrary to the will of God. Likewise, other places around the world, other movements have used the language and theories of liberation theology, most notably James Cone's a famous work, A Black Theology of Liberation. This is Sharon Welch. She was my theology professor at Harvard Divinity School, and she penned this work called A Feminist Theology of Liberation. Likewise, the disabled community has used liberation theology. And a couple of years ago in Spiritual Enrichment, we looked at this book, The Disabled God by Nancy Iceland. And LGBTQ theologies of liberation continue this work called Queer Theology, Asian Theology of Liberation, and then on the right here, Palestinian theologies of liberation using the same language, methods, and so on to cry for justice for the Palestinian people. My last slide here is underscoring something that the previous presenter made, and that is, if this is a real practical way that liberation theology can be lived out in our churches. That many times when we say, what can we do? We go and write a check, which is not a bad thing, but it's about as far from engaging people who live in conditions of oppression as you can get. Or we go and help them, swooping in and then swooping out, which does not build relationships, nor does it really build knowledge about the causes of poverty or what it's really like to live in poverty. And so what's emphasized in liberation theology is if we really want to help people who are oppressed and the underside of society, we need to spend time with them over many years, a lifetime, in fact. Not imitating poverty, but learning, being completely open to the perspective of the poor in their own way. This poor picture I've got here is a favorite of mine because when I was in Zimbabwe, just on my way out of my service in that country in 1994, I helped hook up the United Church of Christ in Zimbabwe that I was serving with the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ USA. And still today, these two churches are in partnership. They have a lot of people-to-people contact between New Hampshire and Zimbabwe, two places you may not think of coming together. And people really learning from one another. And not just learning and not just helping, but having fun together, worshiping together, eating together, getting to know each other's kids and what it's really like to be you and me, and really sharing a relationship. I think this is what Gutierrez and others said is the kind of partnership that results in long-lasting change. But it all started with Gustavo Gutierrez' 1971 classic. Please.
So what was continually going through my mind was wondering if liberation theology has evolved to better understand the structural problems that exist. In particular, it's pretty clear to most of us in the world that Marxism/communism is hardly an answer to the problem of economic dislocation and poverty. So I'm just wondering if, again, if you know if liberation theology is evolved to look at other structural impediments and how to address those.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it has, because you see liberation theology going far beyond the bounds of material poverty only to address issues of gender, race, sexual orientation, and also gender identity. And this is that emerging field called intersectionality that we spent a little bit of time on at WCC early 2021, I think it was. We had a presentation on this. This idea that material poverty alone does not explain the totality of human misery. And so you need to look at poverty. You need to use whatever tools of social analysis are available to you to have the deepest, richest, most accurate view of why there is street violence in Chicago or whatever it is. So I think the answer to your question, although I'm not an expert here, Paul, is I think the point of liberation theology is use any tool of social analysis you can. And
I would add, hopefully, an economic analysis too, because you can't have social equality without an economic system that works for everyone.
here's a funny thing I must share. I did my own senior thesis at Harvard Divinity School on Marxism and the local church.
Hey,
So I was up all night the night before I was to defend it. I was up all night typing on a typewriter, my final copy. So I walked in sleeplessly to my defense of my thesis. And Harvey Cox, a professor who just retired from Harvard Divinity School, said to me, you know, isn't it interesting, Jeffrey, that the only place that Marxism seems to be alive today is in the church? Comment. And I was like, blah, 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 blah. But Marxism has never been very popular in the church. But his point was that it was still then in 1984 anyway, the principal tool by which liberation theology looked at the world. But I think it's come a long way since then.
I was thinking that Father Flagger really represents the essence of liberation theology, and he's really fought the Catholic Church all the way along and really insisting on doing what he needs to do, and has prevailed in many ways.
Yes, and one of the points of liberation theology is when you start encouraging people at the local level to speak and act and look at their church and themselves on their own, what happens to the hierarchy? And so the Catholic Church, that's one principal reason. I think they do it in the name of anti-Marxism, but I think the Catholic Church is very nervous about giving people the tools of social analysis. Because they might just use them and question the wealth and power of the church.
But he's been very successful, I think, in doing what he's doing.
Yeah, good point.
Yes, I wonder how can you get Father Flagger and others to participate in the government so that the separation of church and state seems to come to mind here?
Well, Father Flagger and others do use their voice on social issues. And by social issues, I mean ultimately they're political issues, right? About legislation around gun violence.
Yeah.
And about economic development on the South Side. These become political issues involving the CPS and the Chicago Police Department and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I was thinking more of a status, that they be involved with committee work and so on in Washington.
Yeah, well, sometimes faith-based community organizers become president of the United States. And look at Bobby Rush. Bobby Rush came out of this mold, right? I wouldn't call him a liberation theologian. I don't know if he's even read it, but he came out of this mold of someone who takes faith and applies it at the grassroots for the benefit of the oppressed. And he said, like Barack Obama said, I think I can be more effective as an elected official.